Rachel, thank you so much for being here. We're just super excited for you to share with the Great Communicator Debate Series students. We get to hear more about your insight working for the Reagan Institute and also sharing your experience working in both the private and public sectors of government, and also hearing your insight on party platforms.
Sure.
So to start off, first question I'd like to ask you is what led you to pursue American and international policy? Also, introduce yourself to the students.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Kevin. And thanks to the Reagan Foundation team for having me here. Always such a joy to get to come to the home of the Reagan Foundation and Institute here in Simi Valley. The view is better than our office in Washington, D.C., where I work. We overlook the White House, which is cool, but there's nothing quite like the hills of Simi Valley. So wonderful to meet all of you. I do work at the Ronald Reagan Institute, which is the Washington, D.C. office of the Reagan Foundation. I serve as our policy director, and I run 2 of our 3 policy centers. So the Reagan Institute is there to be the East Coast office, the East Coast branch of the Reagan Foundation, and work to actively promote President Reagan's legacy when it comes to the policy challenges that we face in today's world. Washington, D.C. seems like a pretty good place to do that. So a couple years ago, the foundation opened up the Institute. I run our 2 policy centers that are focused on foreign policy, international affairs, as Gavin mentioned, and national security, national defense. So we have a Center for Peace Through Strength and a Center for Freedom and Democracy. And I run each of those centers with a great policy team and programs team that help do that work. My background before I came to the Reagan Institute, I've been here for a little over 3 years now. And I've worked primarily on Capitol Hill and around Washington at various think tanks, public policy research organizations. How I came to work in international affairs, foreign policy. So I was actually born and raised outside of the US on a military base, a US military base in Japan. I spent my whole upbringing there, was born and graduated from high school on a little army post just outside of Tokyo. And I think that gave me kind of a sense of the world being a much bigger place than the United States from a younger age as we traveled throughout Asia and throughout the world from my earliest childhood. And when it came to thinking about what I wanted to do with my career, I had sort of grown up around these conversations about America's role in the world. I was about your age when North Korea fired a missile over Japan and it landed in the Pacific Ocean, and Japanese people were pretty scared about that, and they talked a lot about the importance of having American military bases there to provide for their defense. And so I kind of grew up around that in a way that was a little bit unique, and I think that's probably one reason why I've landed doing work related to national defense, national security, and foreign policy.
Yeah, no, I find it very fascinating, especially coming from a military family, growing up overseas, and then coming to the United States for higher education, and also having that passion for both domestic and international defense policy is very interesting. So with that, hearing how you developed your interest in that international level of policy, how did your experience in higher education help you when it came to discovering more about your passion for politics?
Yeah, so I moved to the U.S. for college. It was the first time I had ever lived in the U.S. I did college just outside Boston at Tufts University. Sometimes I like to say that I went to a small school outside Boston and just let people assume that I went to Harvard, but I won't do that for you guys. So Tufts is a really wonderful educational environment in terms of higher ed, and it's a small campus. It's just about 5,000 students, and so it's not tiny, but it's definitely not huge, and I could kind of get involved in a really active way, get to know my professors. So my freshman year of college, my first semester, was the Bush v. Gore presidential election. And it was sort of a contentious time in our country. And Tufts University, like most liberal arts schools in New England, is filled with a lot of people who are left of center and who were voting for Al Gore. And I remember because I grew up on a military base, I wasn't really politically attuned like probably a lot of you are with your interest in debate and policy and politics. Like, you probably have a real sense of what you believe at a young age. And it took me a little bit longer, I think, to develop that. Because I grew up in a very apolitical environment. The military, everybody's voting in different absentee elections around the country, and for the most part, the military, members of the military try to stay out of politics and not talk about politics. So college was kind of culture shock for me in that way, where everybody was hyper partisan. I had sort of figured out in late high school that I was a Republican, and I felt very out of place at Tufts. I felt like maybe something was wrong with me, and I just, like all these smart people that I was surrounded by now were Democrats and were voting for Al Gore. And I actually took a class on the presidential election that semester. And one of our assignments was to volunteer for one of the candidates. And I was the only one that wanted to volunteer for George W. Bush, and I couldn't find any opportunities. There just wasn't anything going on in the Boston area. And so my very first political activity was volunteering for Al Gore in the 2000 presidential election. And I went downtown with some other students from the class, and they were coming there for one of the presidential debates. And the Bush campaign just wasn't organizing anything, and the Gore campaign had organized like a sign wave. And so I held a sign that said, "Boston loves Al Gore." And I was like, well, that's just a fact. Like, the people in Boston love Al Gore. That doesn't say anything about what I'm supporting or who I'm voting for. And so it was kind of a strange place for me to come of age politically, but it ended up really strengthening, some of my informal debate skills, not on stage debate, but just engaging and dialoguing with fellow students who often disagreed with me, defending my own beliefs, explaining my own beliefs, and it was a really wonderful place to get to do that for 4 years.
Yeah, awesome. Expanding upon that, especially having a lot of students here that are in high school, also some other interns that are in college, myself going into my senior year at Wheaton College in Illinois, studying political science, where we get to have those kinds of conversations. How would you describe your experience when it came to the discussion of having civil discourse, when it came to expressing your beliefs, your ideas? I know Tony had mentioned it, especially in this new trying times of when it comes to sharing your beliefs, being open, being vulnerable, and actually sharing with others that may disagree with you, but still having the opportunity to discuss that in a respectful manner. How would you say your experience was with that at Tufts? Did you run into challenges at times, or did you feel like Tufts provided a really safe place for you to actually share your beliefs and ideas with other students who might not have agreed with you?
Mm-hmm. Well, I was in college over 20 years ago, and so that was before safe space. The language around safe spaces existed, as some of your parents may remember, and coaches. But I think there were definitely challenges. So I was in college during 9/11, and that was a really hard time for everyone, for no matter your political beliefs, for American students, for international students, for even for faculty to know how to sort of counsel students through that time. And coming out of that, I think, while the country was sort of having like a rally around the flag moment, George W. Bush's popularity was high during that time, the post 9/11 patriotic moment, and that didn't really happen, I think, on a lot of college campuses the way that it did in cities and towns around America. And so that was kind of hard for me, especially as a conservative, to learn how to deal with that. But I think over the next few years, I was then studying abroad in Europe during the invasion of Iraq in the spring of 2003. So that was a strange time to be an American living abroad during the beginning of a very unpopular war, globally unpopular war, and especially unpopular in Europe. And so I wouldn't say that my experience was one of a lot of safe spaces for being vulnerable and sharing my ideas, but it was definitely sort of more maybe trial by fire. And I think what I did find was a lot of people who were interested in having those conversations across difference. So there were many people when I was in college who sort of took some joy out of me being their only Republican friend and getting to actually talk to somebody who believed what, roughly half of the country believes in lots of cases. And so I think today's environment on college campuses is a little bit different. I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about your experience in that regard.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, especially at Wheaton being a evangelical institution, focused on primarily, promoting the gospel when it comes to beliefs. There's still differences. There's still very diverse beliefs in the political science department, and I'm sure at many other places, I'm sure my interns can also agree, there is a divide.
I like how you call them your interns now.
No.
They
Fellow
caught
interns,
that.
we're
They
all.
caught that.
Those are my peeps, right, Bronson? No, but there's definitely this belief that it's almost getting more and more difficult to truly share about your own beliefs, whether or not you're following the party lines, whether or not you're in order, making sure that you're not thinking too radically or too juxtaposed to what other people kind of align with, especially at certain colleges and universities. It definitely can be challenging to navigate that, and feeling like you're having to walk around eggshells to prevent hurting someone's feelings, or demonstrating that you are passionate and that you are confident about what you believe and wanting to share that with others. Not imposing your beliefs onto someone, but educating them. And I think a lot of colleges and universities can benefit from promoting a more welcoming environment for that kind of debate and discussion. I hope you students, especially that are heavily involved in debate, that care, and I'm sure you argue with other students at your schools, but you do it in a respectful manner, and that you also continue to remain passionate about the things that you believe in, and that you're not afraid to back down from that. So good. Moving on now to your experience with the Reagan Institute, being a policy director there, especially specializing in national defense. Can you talk a little bit more about your role there? Also, breaking it down a little bit more, what's the largest initiative currently happening in policy defense?
So the Reagan Institute is kind of a different model than a lot of organizations in Washington. So typically, think tanks or public policy research organizations are going to have a cadre of kind of in-house scholars and experts across different policy areas. So from domestic policy to foreign policy, and then specializations within each of those areas. And at the Reagan Institute, we're a really small team. We're actually only around a dozen people total, and our policy staff was more like 5. And what we do that's a little bit different, and we do across our national security, national defense work, and also our work related to foreign policy and freedom and democracy, is we really focus on convening. So this is something that across all of the Reagan Foundation and Institute programs is really important, bringing people together, kind of like what this program is doing with you all this weekend, the fellowship that Tony was talking about. And so we do that on policy topics. So we will take a particular challenge in the realm of national security and foreign policy and bring together key stakeholders that matter for that discussion, that either have a keen understanding of the problem or maybe the keys to some potential solutions. And so what a lot of my work is kind of organizing and laying the foundations for those convenings and those discussions. So it might be a conference, a public conference with someone delivering a speech on stage. Recently, we had the Deputy Secretary of Defense from the Biden administration come and give a speech about the National Defense Strategy and the Biden administration's budget request, defense budget request. And then we had a panel conversation afterwards with some Republicans and some Democrats, and moderated by a journalist to really engage in the speech that we had just heard, talk about what they agreed with, what they disagreed with, across all of their difference. Sometimes it might be a private roundtable, just 8 or 10 or 12 people getting together in a private setting, and actually that's where some of the more interesting policy conversations come, when they're a little bit more off the record and folks don't have to be worried about what the YouTube clips coming out of the event might be. And then we also do a number of task forces and working groups where we'll take on a particular challenge. We have a big project right now related to national security and technology, a big project related to how to advance freedom and democracy in the context of the new challenges and opportunities we're looking at in the 21st century. And so a number of different policy projects in that regard. We have a big project similar to what you and I were talking about during dinner around how to think about American domestic manufacturing competitiveness and our industrial capacity as it intersects with our national security as well. And so we bring people together over the course of a year, hear from subject matter experts, talk about different aspects of the problem in these task forces or working groups, and then at the end put out a report with findings and recommendations. And then we do a lot of work to promote those findings and policy recommendations and try to affect some change, which ultimately is what most organizations in Washington are about.
Yeah, definitely. And then building upon that, also talking about the general understanding of today, the many concerns that Americans are facing when it comes to cybersecurity, having issues, with Americans concerned about the election results, concerns about the government actually having a secure data system that allows them to withhold, classified information, things that are not supposed to be out there in the public or revealed to other government agencies. So expanding upon that, what kind of policies are there that are being introduced today that Americans should think more about when it comes to their security, their nation's security, and the security of the government's information?
There's been kind of a sea change in that regard in recent years, and government, as it usually is a little bit slow to keep up. But there are some things happening in government, in the executive branch, in Congress, and also kind of in the think tank space to help catch up. One particularly exciting thing is just in the last year, we now have a national cyber director at the White House. So a guy named Chris Inglis, who gave a speech at the Reagan Institute in September of last year, is our first national cyber director. And I actually learned just last week, I met with somebody from the White House and they were telling me it's the first new White House official of that level in over 30 years. So, it's not easy to reform institutionally the way that we organize government, but that's a pretty huge change in terms of having a single authority in the White House that's sort of overseeing and responsible for coordinating in a similar way as the National Security Advisor or some of our other interagency directors in the White House, kind of coordinating between the many, many, many different aspects of government and agencies across government that have skin in the game when it comes to cyber challenges. That reform came from Capitol Hill. It was members of Congress who introduced legislation around creating the National Cyber Director position in the National Defense Authorization Act. What would that have been, 2 years ago, in order for it to be created last year? And that came out of a really cool project, which you wouldn't necessarily think of when you think of sort of the traditional ways that government works and Congress works, or more specifically these days doesn't work and fails to work. There was a project, I think it was 2019, 2020, called the National Cyber Solarium. So this idea that we needed like a national project, a solarium project, to look into this huge new challenge, new-ish, not so new at that time, but increasingly important challenge of cybersecurity. And so there was a bipartisan solarium commission, a Republican and Democrat from the Senate, and a Republican and Democrat from the House, and a whole lot of very smart policy experts who helped staff that cyber solarium, and then over the course of a year or two publish, you'll hear this theme a lot when it comes to government work and think tanks, a report with findings and recommendations. And one of them was creating this National Cyber Director. So I do think that there's change happening, but it's often too little too late in terms of the breaches that we've seen in recent years. But I think we're getting more on the right track.
Yeah, no, awesome. And then again, especially talking with the Reagan Institute, how much developing there is going on there with new positions being introduced. What recommendations would you have for students looking for opportunities to work both in the public and private sectors of government policy? And what kind of opportunities does the Reagan Institute actually offer for students?
The Reagan Institute has a couple of dedicated programs for students, one of which is called Leadership and the American Presidency, which is a summer program in Washington, D.C., where after you've completed at least one semester of college, you can come to DC and really use Washington, DC as your campus. So my colleagues who work on the education and civics team at the Institute put together a program where you're getting college credit for coursework that you're doing in DC. You're also doing an internship where you're placed at, it could be on Capitol Hill, at a government agency, at an advocacy organization, a think tank, a lobbying organization, a media organization, across any kind of work in Washington, DC. And then also doing a lot of site visits to really use Leadership in the American Presidency is the title, because they use the example of the American presidency, not just this American presidency with President Reagan, but do site visits to Mount Vernon and President Lincoln's cottage in Washington, and really get to learn about leadership through that lens of the American presidency. We also have one new program that's just getting off the ground this fall. We'll have our first class of our Civic Leaders Fellowship, which is a new program that's going to be a 6-month program between September and March each year. And it's hybrid format, some virtual that you can participate in from your campus as a college student, but also some in-person experiences, actually bi-coastal, both in Washington, D.C. at the Reagan Institute and also here at the Reagan Library in California. So if you want to come back here from time to time, you might look into the Civic Leaders Fellowship. It's a wonderful program for college students. It doesn't require kind of that dedicated couple months in Washington like the Leadership in the American Presidency program. But one thing I really love about Reagan Institute, even though I can vaguely describe both of those programs, but don't work on any of them in my day job, is that they really bring from the foundation here in California to DC this commitment to fostering the next generation of citizen leaders. And that's something that is, I think, is really admirable about the work that my colleagues do. And I encourage you all to look into some of those opportunities if you're interested.
Yeah. Going into kind of a little bit more personal background, also, experience with partisanship, your experience working for Senator McCain as a policy advisor and representing Washington, D.C., I believe twice as an at-large delegate for the Republican National Convention. Can you tell us a little bit more about your experiences with that, and then also how it shaped your career and maybe your relationship with the Republican Party?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So I told you I kind of figured out I was a Republican late in high school. My AP government teacher actually told me that he thought I was a Republican based on some things I was saying in class. And so I went home and fired up the internet and asked the internet what a Republican was. And it seemed to resonate with me. And so through college, I got involved in college Republicans and eventually found ways to volunteer with Republican campaigns, even at Tufts University. Mostly that meant driving up to New Hampshire and volunteering for Republicans who were running in New Hampshire. Although Mitt Romney ran for governor of Massachusetts and won when I was at college in Boston, and so I got to be a part of that campaign. And then when I came to DC, even though I was working mostly in the policy space with jobs related to foreign policy and national security at think tanks and on Capitol Hill, I always kind of did politics as a hobby. And so I would get involved, for example, I was very involved in my 20s in an organization called the Young Republicans, which is the young professionals version of the college Republicans. And eventually I got involved in the DC Republican Party, which is kind of just our local or state, kind of both local and state Republican Party. So as you might have the Simi Valley Republican Party or the County Republican Party or the California Republican Party or Democratic Party, of course. In DC, it's just our local Republican Party, unrelated to or as our affiliate to the national RNC. And so I got to, because there are actually not so many Republicans who live in the district, it's really easy to get involved in a place like DC. And so I got the opportunity to be a delegate to the 2012 Republican National Convention and the 2016 Republican National Convention. And then shortly after that, in 2017, 17, 18, 19 is when, or 17, 18 is when I worked for Senator McCain. And that was kind of, speaking more to the personal side, it was a little bit more of a, the Republican Party changed a lot during those years. And so working for Senator McCain especially was a wonderful opportunity for me to get to work for obviously kind of a legend in not just the party, but the American political system and American history, I think. And so that for me was really sort of the opportunity of a lifetime. I worked for him for the last 18 months of his life and career in the Senate. I served as his speechwriter and policy advisor. And so I wrote basically anything he was doing related to foreign policy, national security, national defense, of which a lot of the things that he did were related to those issues. He was chairman of the Armed Services Committee during the time that I worked for him. And so I would draft all of his opening statements for hearings or floor speeches on the floor of the Senate, or speeches at think tanks, or events that he would do in the evenings. And it was a really wonderful opportunity, and I definitely learned a lot and valued that experience.
Yeah, incredible. And then building upon what you've talked about as being a Republican, and the many experiences that you've had with the RNC, in today's time, we always discuss the ideas of, extremist politics, especially with very committed partisanship when it comes to individuals strongly believing in one's party's beliefs. But that's not necessarily the case. A majority of both Democrats and Republicans would claim themselves to be more moderate on the side of what they believe. And so with that, how has your experience been with being a Republican, but also being more open-minded to certain policy initiatives and legislative agendas? I know that there were some times where you tried to revise certain ideologies and rhetoric with the Republican Party. I think it would be incredible to hear more about your experience with that.
Sure. So one thing I'm really inspired by your generation is this idea that maybe we don't just have to do the two-party system. I was talking to Gabe earlier tonight, who came by the Reagan Institute a couple weeks ago with a student program. How many students do you think? 60? 49. And I asked them how many were excited to be a Republican or a Democrat, whichever one it was, and how many were sort of unenthused about either of those options, and whether they were more to the middle or more to either of the extremes, or just didn't like it altogether. And the vast majority of those high school students didn't like either option. And one of the things that for me, coming up politically when I was your age, and then into my young adulthood and starting my career, I didn't love everything about the Republican Party or agree with everything in the Republican Party platform ever. I mean, I think, and I certainly didn't agree with 100% of the ideas and beliefs of every candidate I ever voted for. But that's not really part of the deal. There's a great saying that if you want to vote for somebody with whom you agree 100% of the time, then you have to run for office and vote for yourself. And so probably the most significant experience I had with that in both disagreeing with my party and trying to do something about it was when I was a delegate to the 2016 Republican National Convention. I also had the opportunity to serve on the platform committee. So each state has 2 delegates that serve on the platform committee. So it's not 100 because DC exists and also the various territories. So it's around 120, 130 people from literally all around the country writing the platform of the Republican Party. And during that time, I proposed an amendment to change the language that was in the Republican Party platform on LGBTQ rights. And in particular, this was 2016, so marriage equality, the Supreme Court decision on marriage equality had just happened the year before. So the Republican Party platform had a really strong stance against that decision. And in that process, I actually came out as the first openly gay member of the Republican Party Platform Committee, and asked my colleagues in the room to think about the message that we were sending, not just to LGBTQ Americans, but also to a lot of young Americans, young Republicans, well, young Americans under 40 by a huge margin support the freedom to marry or marriage equality even years ago in 2016. And even young Republicans at that time, Republicans under 40, a majority of them supported the freedom to marry. And so I thought for both, it was sort of a politically wise thing to do to change our position on that issue, but also I just thought it was the right thing to do. I thought that if we were going to be the party of freedom and equality and liberty and limited government and individual rights, that it was kind of a conservative thing to do to support the freedom to marry. And that amendment did not pass. It went down pretty spectacularly, but I think about 25% of the committee voted with me on that. Obviously, it wasn't enough to change the party platform on it, but I think the experience was something that I really value, just in saying, where your opinions don't align with a party that you might choose to get involved with, or a politician that you might vote for or even work for. It's not, you don't just have to go along to get along. You can actually stand up, try to make a difference, and sort of try to create the world that you want to live in, not just in the party you want to live in, the person you want to work for, not just kind of accept the way that it's handed to you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And of course, being bold in that is just a testament to your beliefs and how passionate you are about that. And I think that's exactly what we need in American leaders just of this day and for the future to come. And so with my final question before we get into closing with a Q&A for you students, my final question for you, Rachel, is if you had one piece of life-changing advice to any student, faculty, or staff member here, what would you tell them?
Well, I won't share the same advice I shared last year. Somebody already reminded me of that, and I see a couple familiar faces in the audience. So one of the best pieces of advice that I've ever gotten was, which is a little bit unexpected for me, was from my dad. No offense to any parents in the audience. Because my dad he's not into politics. He was a teacher and in the Army Reserve for his life. He doesn't really understand this career thing that I'm doing and why I change jobs all the time, because he had the same job for the 30 years of his career. But he gave it to me when I was about your age, and I was really struggling with the decision of which college to go to. First, of which colleges to apply for, and then once I got in, knew where I'd gotten in, which college to go to. And he could tell that I was really struggling with it, as though it was like the decision that I'm making between X school and Y school. Tufts was one of them, whatever the other ones were. I can't even really remember at the time these days. That I was struggling with it as though it was a decision between a path to success and a path to failure. And what he told me was that for people like me, decisions like that were choices between different paths to success. And I think that's true for people in your shoes as well, that you're obviously doing the right things already by being involved in programs like this and all of the involvement that you have at your high schools and looking forward to college and universities, that decisions that you make along the way, whether it's which college to go to, what major to decide on, where to study abroad, what's your first job going to be, where are you going to live after college, they're not for people that have sort of this drive and motivation inside of them. You'll look back and you'll say, man, if I hadn't gone there, then I wouldn't be here. And thank goodness things sort of played out in that way, as though it was sort of how you planned it from the beginning, even though probably the pieces just sort of fall into place. And so that's something that I kind of I've taken a lot of comfort in at various stages of my education, and then the early part of my career especially. It sort of took a little bit of the weight off, okay, it's not like this is a decision between right or wrong. It's just sort of different kinds of right.
Yeah, awesome. Well, Rachel, thank you so much. Give me a round of applause for Rachel Hoff.
Thank you.
Now I would like to open up to you students and also parents if you have any questions for Rachel that you would like to ask. Yes. There's a microphone going around, sorry.
So I am about to register to vote because I just turned 18. Would you suggest, and I don't really feel strongly I'm not gonna register Republican, I'm probably not gonna register Democratic, or I haven't quite decided. Would you just recommend registering independent so I can kind of make the choice kind of as I figure out more stuff?
So that question really depends on what state you live in. And the reason is because various states have very different rules on primaries. So often in some states, I should say, I actually don't know, obviously don't know all 50 of the rules, but I also don't know what the breakdown is. But in many states, you can't vote in a primary if you're not registered with the party. So the only way you could vote in a Republican or Democratic primary would be to be registered with that party. And if you're an independent, you don't get to vote in either primary. So that sort of would be, if you're in a state like that, a reason maybe to choose one or the other, even if you're not gonna vote with that party 100% of the time, because at least you have some agency in the primary process. There's other states where, my parents live in Washington State, and you can, even if you're registered with a party, you can vote in the other party's primary. So that would be less of an issue, and then you could certainly register as an independent, and you could choose each year if you wanted to vote in the Republican primary or the Democratic primary. Some people, by the way, even in Washington, D.C., where our Democratic primary for mayor is basically the election because it's 9% Republicans in Washington, D.C. by registration. So a lot of my Republican friends are actually registered locally as Democrats just so that they can vote between the different Democratic mayoral primary candidates and have a say, have a voice in that process. So all things being equal, sort of not knowing where you're from and what those rules are, I would say there are some advantages to being involved with a party and trying to create change from within, like I was saying, even if you're not 100% aligned with the party. But I do think that I know that the trends are very much in the opposite direction, where more and more Americans, and especially more and more young Americans, are registering without a party. And I think that's really turning some of the ways that we think about our two-party system on their head. And so I kind of am interested to see where that trend goes. So I don't want to too strongly recommend registering with a party, because I think there's going to be interesting things happening as more and more Americans and young registrants to vote in particular do either register as an independent, or sometimes you just are unregistered with a party.
Hello, my name is Caleb Knox. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us just now. I wanted to ask you about, you were mentioning how at the Institute, part of the project is bringing in a lot of voices, and whether that's spanning the political divide. I just think that's a really great project. But one of the things I was wondering is there any tension within, you have beliefs that you're advocating for, and then you're also bringing in other people? Because, if you're a heritage, right, you kind of have this orthodoxy that you can set within house. And it's it just makes probably the advocacy a little cleaner. But with your organization, if you're bringing in different voices to the table, does that sometimes make things more difficult on the advocacy side, or do you find that it's really just a benefit because you're hearing from different shareholders, as you said?
It's a great question. I think it's one of the valuable things about working for a presidential foundation and institute as opposed to a think tank. Our mandate is to carry on the legacy and leadership values, principles of Ronald Reagan. But not in the way that we're, locked into talking about only the policies that were relevant in the 1980s, right? In a way that keeps those, his values and principles alive for today's world. That's really easy to do with President Reagan because he had so many really clearly identifiable core beliefs that are relevant to today's world. So for example, the two centers that I run are our Center for Peace Through Strength and our Center for Freedom and Democracy. So using peace through strength as an example, that was, President Reagan's shorthand for his kind of top-line defense policy, national security approach. That has really broad bipartisan appeal right now. There are a lot of Democrats and Republicans that agree with kind of a peace through strength approach to the world. When I worked at the Senate Armed Services Committee, I would say, in the Senate, with a few exceptions on both sides, I think the vast majority of U.S. senators are kind of between, what's the saying, the 80-yard lines, the 20-yard lines? You're a football guy. In the middle, in the big middle of the field. And then you have a few, sort of like neo-isolationists or libertarians on the right, and a few sort of like nation building at home types on the left. But most people agree that a strong American military is important to not just our own security, but the peace, stability, and security of the world. So I find that we're able to bring in, on that issue, freedom and democracy is certainly one of them, too, another area where I'd say President Reagan's legacy on the importance of advancing freedom around the world is as alive and well is alive and well in both parties, let's say. So, for example, we just did a big working group and then published a report and held a launch event on under our Center for Freedom and Democracy, and we had the Undersecretary of State from the Biden administration for democracy and human rights come and use our stage to talk about what the Biden administration was doing to promote President Reagan's legacy on those issues. And so I see what you mean about some of the tensions, especially like the more ideological the work of a public policy organization gets. But I think because our work is focused on these broad principles, which enjoy broad bipartisan support right now, I've seen it work well more than I've seen it be hard.
I was just wondering, have you ever considered running for office, or do you think the change that you want to enact in the party is best done kind of behind the scenes?
Yeah. I have considered it, and I have decided not to. I think there are very much two kinds of people that you meet in DC or that are sort of involved in the political policy enterprise. Those that see being in public office themselves as a path to create change, and those that very much never want to do that, and I am in that latter category. I ran for fake office once. I ran for national chairman of the Young Republicans. It was kind of a legit thing. I went to 27 states for my campaign. I led a ticket of 13 candidates who were running for other offices in the organization, and I lost. And I was actually really happy that I did, because it opened up a bunch of other things in my career that I wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. But also it taught me that candidate life is just not for me. But one of the things that I think that I didn't understand about this world when I was kind of considering in high school and college and sort of considering what jobs might be available to someone like me, knowing that I was interested in politics and then majoring in political science in college, was that there are all sorts of other ways to be involved too. There's obviously the people that work for the politicians, whether it's on the campaign, which I've done a little bit of as well, or once in public office, of course, they have quite large staffs, both at home in their district or their state and in DC. But also this whole world of think tanks and research organizations and advocacy is really, I think, provides a lot of opportunities for how to get involved if you do kind of want to take more of that behind the scenes approach. Although you guys are on stage debaters, so you might be the run for office type.
I think we have time for a few more questions, right, Chris? Good. All right. Yeah. In the back, Fred. Oh, never mind.
Hi.
Sorry. My bad, Nathan.
I ended up with the mic. So you said, and I definitely agree with it, but the Republican Party has changed a lot in the last 10 years. What would you say is the main thing you would celebrate about the GOP as it stands today?
I'll pick two things. One, picking up on my my example I shared earlier about being somebody who was advocating for more of a inclusive and equitable approach on LGBTQ rights. So this week, the House of Representatives voted on codifying marriage equality as a law of the land. Every Democrat voted for it, and 47 Republicans voted for it, which meant 157 Republicans voted against it. That's not great, but I actually Googled an article because I like stuck out in my memory from 2013. The Washington Post headline was called "Meet the 4 Republicans in Congress that support marriage equality." 2 of them were in the House and 2 of them were in the Senate. 2 in the House of Representatives, now it's 47. So a lot of work to go or a lot of work to do in my opinion, in solidifying that more, if that's something you believe in for the Republican Party, but that's progress. The second thing I would say is kind of back to this peace through strength being a really having broad support, bipartisan, but to your question, in the Republican Party in particular, there was a moment in 2010, 2011, so kind of in that 10-year window, where it sort of looked like isolationism was going to be the way to go for the Republican Party. We're coming out of the Bush administration where there were some unpopular wars. People were really reluctant about, this foreign interventionism. Republicans were very critical of the Obama administration for some things that they were doing, like, for example, in American leadership on climate change and all of that. And so it seemed like it might be like a politically popular thing to do to talk about America doing less in the world. Let's solve our problems here at home. And you saw some candidates, particularly, and this is like ancient history for the students here, but for that Tea Party class of 2010 that came into Congress. And what happened over the next several years was a number of global events that I think showed the American people, but in particular Republican leaders, that America doing less in the world was not going to solve the world's problems. So the rise of ISIS in Iraq and Syria, Vladimir Putin's invasion of Georgia and then Crimea, and one other that I forgot. You should never choose to number your points before you start doing them. Tomorrow, keep in mind. You can have your own Rick Perry moment on stage. So I think what the shift that I've seen is toward this idea that American leadership in the world actually matters and helps create a better world, not just for securing America's interests and what we want to do around the world, but also kind of peace, right? That's putting the peace in peace through strength, I think, is a really important part of that message and that actual substantive policy contribution.
Yeah, we'll go, and then I know you've been raising your hand the whole time.
Hi, my name is James, and I want to thank you again for speaking to us. I think that, over the past couple of years, the conservative think tank space has seen a lot of success when they focused on social issues like education, race, and gender. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that, both in terms of how it's impacted you as someone who also operates in that space, but focuses on, policy issues as it relates to national security, and also, I guess, your personal thoughts, since you delivered that powerful anecdote about trying to move the party on these social issues and how it's affected you.
I want to learn more about your assessment of the think tanks focusing on that, because what I think I've observed is politicians focusing a lot on those issues because I think they view them to be vote-moving issues for Republican voters. But I don't, and this is very much not my policy area, so maybe you know more about it than me. I don't see a lot of think tanks engaging in that work in terms of kind of substantive approaches to policy, maybe with the exception of education on your list. But I don't see a lot of think tanks doing work on race and gender in that context. Education policy, the school choice movement on the right is a real animating policy issue for a lot of conservative think tanks. And so I think, there's a degree to which leaders talk about things that matter to the people that they're leading. I think often leaders help shape what people care about, so it can, like, it's a two-way street. And I think right now we're seeing a lot of the street going in the other direction, where I think leaders are influenced by what they at least perceive people to care about on that issue set.
All right, we have time for one more question, so we'll go to the front here.
Yeah, okay, so a little bit piggybacking off Jimmy's question. I'm Peter, by the way. I want to reiterate the statements, like, thank you so much for doing this talk. But so I'm interested in what you were saying about the recent House vote on marriage equality. And because you put an optimistic spin on the Republican numbers, which I think I haven't really seen anywhere else. And you also told us, the ways in which you've been fighting for that for a long time, even within the party. So I suppose my question is, as my generation specifically gets more and more important in political spheres and elections, do you see that shift in the Republican Party to supporting not only things like marriage equality, but things like perhaps transgender rights? Do you see that as vital to the survival of the party or the conservative ideology, like I said, as more and more young people become a voting force?
I think it is. I think it is a vote-defining issue for young people, from the polls I've seen. And this, of course, is, overall, not speaking to any individual young person's priorities or beliefs, but there's a degree to which not just young people in your generation, but young people under the age of 40, where there are a lot of young people that don't even aren't even willing to give the Republican Party a chance because of its stance on a number of social issues. And I think there are lots of different ways to make an argument about how the Republican Party maybe should evolve on those issues, but political viability is a pretty strong one. I do think that I'm really interested to see how the difference between marriage equality, on which public opinion shifted incredibly quickly over a very short period of time, and the conversation around transgender rights and equality, which I'm curious to see how public opinion moves on that in comparison. I would just say the marriage question happened more quickly than I think we've seen almost any other social change in history, and I'm curious if the T part of the LGBTQ issues will mirror that, or will mirror more closely other social issues. I'd be curious what you all think on that, especially, like you say, it being kind of an important set of issues to young voters in particular, or young soon-to-be voters in particular.
Awesome. Well, just love to give a round of applause for you, Rachel. Thank you so much for flying out and talking to us.